The man on the train platform is a wall of expensive wool and cheap cruelty. His voice, a resonant boom meant for boardrooms and cattle auctions, slices through the dusty air of Promise Creek, and every word is a stone thrown at the woman standing before him. She is small, plain as a sparrow, and clutching a worn valise that seems to be the sum of her worldly possessions. Her name is Eleanora Vance, and she has traveled 1,427 miles to become a bride. Now, she is becoming a spectacle. This is not what was advertised, the man, Jedediah Croft, declares, loud enough for the station master, the baggage handlers, and the half-dozen townsfolk lingering in the midday heat to hear. He waves a photograph, a stark, formal portrait. The picture showed a woman of substance. Health. You, he says, his gaze sweeping over her slight frame, her travel-worn dress, her pale face, are a wisp. A pauper's ghost. I have a business to maintain, a household to run. I require a wife, not a charity case I'll have to nurse through the winter. Nora, flinches with each pronouncement. Her chin trembles, but she does not lower her eyes. From his bench outside the general store across the street, Elias Thorne watches the scene unfold, a knot of cold anger tightening in his gut. Beside him, his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, presses closer, her small hand finding his. Her face, usually so open and bright, is clouded with a fierce, protective sorrow. She understands injustice in the pure, undiluted way a child does. Please, Mr. Croft. Nora's voice is low, but it carries a surprising strength, a thread of steel in the cotton of her fear. The journey was long. I am weary is all. I am a hard worker. I can cook and clean and mend. I can hire a girl for $1 a week to do that. Croft scoffs, pocketing the photograph as if its very existence now offended him. I paid your passage, which was a fool's investment. I will not be making another. The arrangement is concluded. You are on your own. He turns his back on her, a final, brutal dismissal, and strides toward his waiting buggy. The onlookers, who had been a silent chorus of curiosity, now begin to mutter amongst themselves. Some shake their heads in pity, others in smug agreement with Croft's assessment. No one moves to help. She is a stranger, a problem that belongs to no one. The train that brought her gives a final, mournful whistle and begins to chug away, leaving Nora utterly alone on the platform, an island in a sea of indifference. Her shoulders, which had been so straight, finally begin to slump. The fight drains out of her, replaced by a visible wave of desolation. She has nowhere to go. She has nothing. Papa, Lily whispers, her voice tight. That's not right. He was mean. Elias says nothing. He's a man of few words, a widower whose life is etched into the lines around his eyes and the calluses on his hands. He knows Croft, a man who measured everything, land, cattle, people, in terms of profit and loss. He sees the woman on the platform not as a person, but as a failed transaction. Elias looks at her worn shoes, the determined set of her jaw even in defeat, and he sees something else. He sees the echo of another woman, his late wife, who had faced the harshness of this land with a quiet fortitude that had been the bedrock of his world. He feels a familiar, unwelcome pang of responsibility. He doesn't want to get involved. He has his own struggles, his own ghosts. His ranch is barely making it, and taking on another mouth to feed is a fool's errand. But then he looks at Lily, at the raw empathy in her eyes, an empathy he and his wife had so carefully nurtured. How can he teach her about decency if he turns his back now? The world is full of Jedediah Crofts. It needs fewer men who watch and do nothing. He feels Lily tug on his sleeve again, more insistently this time. Papa, we can't just leave her there. The spurned bride finally moves. She walks to the end of the platform and sits on her valise, her back to the town, facing the endless, shimmering expanse of the prairie, as if searching for an answer in the heat haze. It is a posture of profound loneliness. Elias lets out a slow breath, the dust of the street settling around him. He knows this is a mistake, a complication he cannot afford. But the image of his daughter's face, mirrored by the despair on the stranger's, makes his decision for him. He gives Lily's hand a squeeze, a silent promise. And with a heavy sigh that seems to carry the weight of the last 3 lonely years, he stands up and starts across the street, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust that mark his path toward the woman on the platform. His life, and hers, and Lily's, were about to be irrevocably changed. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The woman doesn't hear him approach until his shadow falls over her. She looks up, her eyes, a surprising, clear gray, widening with alarm. They are red-rimmed but tearless, as if she has willed her sorrow into submission. He sees she is young, perhaps no older than 20, but her expression holds the weariness of a much longer, harder life. "Ma'am," Elias said, his voice rusty from disuse. He stopped a respectful few feet away, holding his hat in his hands. Lily stood half-hidden behind his leg, peering out with wide, curious eyes. Nora scrambled to her feet, clutching her valise like a shield. "Sir?" she asked, her voice wary. She expected more scorn, another command to move along. "My name is Elias Thorne. This is my daughter, Lily," he gestured with his hat. "We saw what happened." A flush of shame crept up her neck. To be rejected was one thing. To have it witnessed was another, a deeper humiliation that felt as if it had been branded onto her skin. She simply nodded, unable to form words. "You have a place to go?" he asked. It was a gentle question, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Her gaze flickered away, back toward the empty tracks that stretched to the horizon. I had thought my place was to be here." "Croft is a man who values livestock more than people," Elias said, the statement flat and factual. "His judgment isn't worth the dust on your shoes." He wasn't a man for pretty speeches, but the words felt necessary. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not gratitude, not yet, but a sliver of surprise. "Be that as it may, sir, it leaves me in a difficult position." He knew it did. A single woman with no money and no connections in a town like Promise Creek had few options, and none of them were good. The saloon, or the slow starvation of trying to find work as a laundress or seamstress where there were already too many. "We live out north of here," he said, the words coming out before he had fully formed the plan in his head. "It's not much, a small ranch, but it has a roof. And we have need of a helping hand." He hesitated, fumbling for the right way to phrase it, the way that would offer dignity instead of charity. "I can't pay you much. Room and board, and a small wage when the cattle sell in the fall. It would be temporary, until you can decide what to do next." Nora stared at him, her gray eyes searching his face for a trick, a hidden motive. She saw a man in his early 30s, his face weathered by sun and wind, his hair the color of sun-bleached straw. He looked tired, but his eyes were direct and steady. She looked down at the little girl, who was now staring at her openly, her expression one of solemn evaluation. "Why?" Nora asked, the single word soft but pointed. Elias's gaze drifted to his daughter. "Because Lily is right. It wasn't a decent way to treat a person. And because my ma always said the measure of a man is what he does when no one's forcing his hand." He put his hat back on, a signal that the offer was made and the conversation, for his part, was over. "The wagon's over at the general store. We're loading up supplies. You can think on it." He turned and walked away, Lily trotting to keep up, her small hand once again in his. He didn't look back. The choice had to be hers. He felt the weight of the town's eyes on him now. He'd seen the curtains twitch in the window of the mercantile, seen Sheriff Brody pause in his patrol to watch the exchange. By sundown, the gossip would be all over Promise Creek. The quiet widower Elias Thorne had picked up Croft's rejected mail-order bride. He braced himself for the speculation, the knowing smirks. Nora watched them go. The man was rough-hewn, his clothes clean but patched. The girl was his miniature, with the same serious eyes. She looked at her valise, which contained one change of dress, a Bible from the orphanage where she'd been raised, and a small tin of her mother's hairpins. It was everything she had. She looked at the town, which had already judged and dismissed her. Then she looked at the man's retreating back. He hadn't offered pity. He had offered work. He had offered a roof. He had offered a sliver of dignity when hers had been stripped from her in public. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she picked up her valise. Her legs felt heavy, but she made them move. She followed the man and his daughter across the dusty street. walking toward the only kindness she had been shown in 1,000 miles. The ride to the Thorn Ranch was a silent affair, punctuated only by the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels. Nora sat in the back, perched on her valise, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The landscape unrolled around them, a vast, unforgiving canvas of brown earth and pale sky. It was beautiful in its own stark way, but it was a beauty that promised hardship, not comfort. It seemed to swallow the small wagon whole, a constant reminder of their insignificance. Elias kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his shoulders set. He felt Nora's presence behind him like a weight. He was already regretting his impulsiveness. What had he been thinking? Bringing a strange woman into his home, into Lily's life. His wife, Sarah, had been the heart of this place. Since she'd been taken by fever 3 years ago, the house had become just that. A house, not a home. He and Lily existed in it, their lives dictated by the seasons and the needs of the cattle. They were a closed circle of two, a world of shared grief and quiet understanding. He had just broken that circle open. Lily, however, seemed to have no such reservations. She kept twisting around on the wagon seat to look at Nora, her expression a mixture of childish curiosity and an almost adult-like solemnity. Finally, she broke the silence. "My name is Lily," she announced, as if they were being formally introduced in a parlor. Nora, startled, managed a small smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Lily. I am Nora. Are you sad because of that mean man?" Lily asked, her voice clear and direct. Elias shot a warning look over his shoulder. "Lily, that's not our business." "But it is," Lily insisted, ignoring him. "We saw it. It is our business now." Nora's smile faltered, but she answered the child with a surprising directness of her own. "Yes, I was sad, and angry, and a little bit frightened." "My papa isn't mean," Lily stated, as if this were the most important fact in the world. "He's just quiet. Ma used to say he was a deep well. You have to wait a long time for the bucket to come up, but the water is always cool and clear." Elias felt his ears burn. He hadn't heard Sarah's words quoted back to him in years. Hearing them from his daughter, spoken to a stranger, felt like a strange sort of betrayal, a violation of their private memories. "Lily," he said, his voice sharper this time. "That's enough." Lily fell silent, but she gave Nora a small, conspiratorial look before turning back around. Nora felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. The child's simple, unwavering loyalty to her father was a beautiful thing. She had been raised in an orphanage where loyalty was a currency you spent carefully and often on the wrong people. After another hour, they topped a rise, and Elias gestured with his whip. "There it is." The ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, a small, sturdy-looking cabin with a stone chimney, a respectable barn, and a web of corrals. It was an island of human effort in the vast wilderness. It looked lonely, tidy, but achingly lonely. There were no flowers by the door, no curtains in the windows. It was a place of function, not comfort. When they pulled up, Elias helped Nora down from the wagon. She nearly stumbled, her legs stiff from the ride. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch brief and impersonal, but his grip was strong and sure. For a moment, she felt a flicker of safety she hadn't realized she'd been craving. "The house ain't much," he said, already unhitching the horse. "There's a small room off the main one. It was a storage room, but it has a cot. It'll be yours." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," Nora said, her voice barely a whisper. "You are very kind." "It's not kindness," he grunted, avoiding her eyes. "It's a business arrangement. You work, you have a place to stay. That's all." He was building a wall between them, and she understood why. He was protecting himself and his daughter from a complication. She was a stray he'd brought in from the storm. He didn't want to be expected to name her. Lily, however, was having none of it. She grabbed Nora's hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong. "Come on," she said, pulling her toward the cabin. "I'll show you." Papa built the chimney all by himself after a lightning strike. He's very good at building things. The inside of the cabin was as stark as the outside. It consisted of one large room that served as kitchen, dining room, and living space. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves holding a meager collection of plates and tins. A door led to what was clearly Elias's bedroom, and a simple curtain partitioned off another corner, which Nora assumed was Lily's space. The whole place was clean, scrubbed bare, but it lacked any softness, any touch of grace. It was the home of a man who was simply enduring. Lily led her to a narrow door at the back. The room behind it was tiny, barely big enough for the narrow cot and a small crate for a table. A single small window looked out onto the endless prairie. It was little more than a cell, but to Nora, who had expected to sleep in a barn or on the street, it was a palace. "This is perfect," she said, and her voice was thick with genuine emotion. She set her valise on the cot. "Thank you." Lily beamed. "Papa says we eat when the sun hits the top of that big rock over there." She pointed out the window. "Are you a good cook?" Ma was. "She made the best biscuits." "Papa tries, but his are hard." She whispered the last word as if it were a grave secret. Nora felt another smile, this one less fragile. "I make tolerable biscuits," she said. That evening, Nora moved around the small kitchen with a quiet efficiency that Elias found himself watching from the corner of his eye. He sat at the table, mending a bridle, pretending to be absorbed in his work. He'd expected awkwardness, a fumbling uncertainty. Instead, she seemed to instinctively know where things were, how to work the temperamental wood stove, how to make a meal out of the salt pork, beans, and flour they'd bought in town. She found a small, dusty tin of herbs on a high shelf and added a pinch to the beans. She mixed the biscuit dough with a light, practiced hand. Soon, the cabin, which usually smelled of leather, wood smoke, and loneliness, was filled with the warm, savory scent of baking bread and simmering pork. It was the smell of a home, and it hit Elias with the force of a memory he had long tried to suppress. When she set the plates on the table, they were simple, but the food was arranged with a care he hadn't seen in years. The biscuits were light and fluffy, just as Sarah's had been. He took a bite, and the taste was so familiar, so achingly reminiscent of a life that was gone, that he had to close his eyes for a moment. Lily, of course, had no such restraint. "These are just like Ma's," she exclaimed, her mouth full. "Papa, aren't they just like Ma's?" Elias cleared his throat, pushing the uncomfortable emotion down. "They're good biscuits, Miss Vance," he said formally, not looking at her. "Please," Nora said quietly, sitting down with her own plate. "Call me Nora." He just nodded, focusing on his food. But the meal was a turning point. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the quiet competence, the gentle presence that had filled the empty spaces in his home without making a sound. He'd brought her here out of a grudging sense of duty, a lesson for his daughter. He was beginning to suspect he'd done something far more complicated than that. He had let a ghost of his old life in the door, and he wasn't sure he was strong enough to handle it. After the meal, as Nora quietly washed the dishes in the dim lamplight, Lily approached her, holding a small, worn rag doll. One of its button eyes was loose. "Can you fix her?" Lily asked. "Her name is Sarah? After my mom." Nora took the doll, her heart aching for the little girl. She examined the loose thread. "I can," she said softly. "I have a needle and thread in my valise. I will fix her first thing in the morning." Lily leaned against her, a gesture of complete, childish trust. "Ma would have fixed her too," she murmured, her voice sleepy. Then she looked from Nora to her father, who was still sitting at the table, watching them. A thoughtful, serious expression crossed her face. "If Ma existed," she murmured, almost to herself, her voice soft as a moth's wing, "I think she'd mirror her." The words hung in the quiet air of the cabin. Elias froze, the piece of leather in his hands forgotten. He stared at his daughter, then at Nora, who was looking down at the doll, a faint blush on her cheeks. It was a child's simple, profound observation, a comparison of the sainted memory of her mother to this spurned, penniless stranger. And in that moment, Elias felt a tremor of fear. This was getting dangerous. He had offered this woman a job, a temporary refuge. But his daughter, in her innocent wisdom, was offering her a place in their lives, a place in their hearts. A place that had been empty for 3 long, hollow years. The days that followed settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Nora rose before the sun, her movements soft as she stoked the fire and put the coffee on to boil. Elias would come in from the barn, the cold morning air clinging to him, and find a hot cup waiting on the table. They rarely spoke in those early hours, but the silence was different now. It was no longer the empty, echoing silence of two lonely people, but a shared, companionable quiet. Nora proved to be more than just a tolerable biscuit maker. She had a knack for making much from little. She found a patch of wild onions behind the barn and added them to their stews. She repaired Elias's work shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She took the drab, functional cabin and began to subtly transform it. One day, Elias came home to find a jar of wildflowers on the table. Another day, she had taken 2 old flour sacks and sewn them into simple, clean curtains for the main window, softening the harsh afternoon light. He said nothing about these changes. To acknowledge them would be to acknowledge her presence as more than that of a temporary hired hand. But he noticed. Every single detail he noticed. And each small touch was like a gentle hand pressing on an old bruise, a pain that was both sharp and strangely welcome. Lily, for her part, was blossoming under Nora's quiet attention. She followed Nora everywhere, a small, chattering shadow. Nora would listen to Lily's endless stories about her pony, the shapes she saw in the clouds, and her memories of her mother. Nora never tried to replace Sarah. Instead, she became the keeper of Lily's memories, listening with a reverence that gave the child's recollections a new weight and importance. One afternoon, Elias was reshoeing the wagon horse when he heard laughter from the small vegetable garden Sarah had planted and he had let go to weeds. He looked over and saw Nora and Lily, their heads bent together, hands deep in the dark earth. Nora was patiently showing Lily how to tell a weed from a carrot shoot. Lily said something, and Nora threw her head back and laughed, a genuine, musical sound that the wind carried over to the barn. The sound stopped him cold, the horseshoe heavy in his hand. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard a woman's laughter on this ranch. It felt like a trespass, a sacrilege. And yet, it was also like the first spring rain on parched ground. He felt a powerful, conflicting surge of emotions. Resentment that this stranger could bring joy where he had only managed to sustain survival, and a deep, unwilling gratitude for the very same reason. He quickly turned back to his work, hammering the nails into the hoof with more force than was necessary, the rhythmic clang a desperate attempt to drown out the sound of life returning to his world. Nora, too, was undergoing a transformation. The timid, shamed woman from the train platform was slowly receding, replaced by a quiet confidence. The prairie, which had at first seemed so menacing, was becoming familiar. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the language of the wind, the importance of a well-stocked larder. She was working harder than she ever had in her life, her hands becoming rough and chapped, but she felt a sense of purpose that was entirely new. She was not a wife, not a charity case, but a contributor. She was earning her place. Her relationship with Elias remained one of careful distance. He was a good man, she knew that. She saw it in the gentle way he handled his animals, in the fierce, protective love he had for his daughter. But he was also a man walled off by grief. She saw the sadness that lurked in the back of his eyes, the way he would sometimes stare off into the distance, his thoughts clearly on a world she was not a part of. She respected his sorrow, and she was careful not to intrude. She kept her conversations with him brief and practical, focused on the needs of the household or the ranch. But sometimes, their carefully constructed walls would crack. One evening, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in, the kind that made the whole cabin shake. Lily, who was usually fearless, had a deep-seated terror of lightning. As the first clap of thunder rattled the windows, she let out a small cry and ran not to her father, but to Nora. Nora wrapped her arms around the trembling child, holding her tight. "It's all right, little bird," she murmured, stroking her hair. "It's just the sky making a big noise. It can't hurt us in here." Elias stood by the fireplace, watching them. He had always been the one to comfort Lily during storms, his large presence a solid shield against her fear. But tonight, she had sought a different kind of comfort, a softer one. Nora began to hum a gentle, nameless tune, her voice a low, steady counterpoint to the raging storm outside. Lily's trembling slowly subsided, her face buried in Nora's dress. Elias felt a sharp, painful pang of something. It wasn't jealousy. It was more like a profound sense of his own inadequacy. He could provide, protect, and work himself to the bone for his daughter, but he could not provide this. He could not provide the soft, humming comfort of a woman's presence. He had tried, for 3 years, to be both father and mother to Lily, and in that moment, he felt the crushing weight of his failure. After the storm had passed, and Lily was asleep in her curtained-off bed, Nora and Elias were left in the flickering lamplight. The air was thick with unspoken things. "She's never been that calm during a storm before," Elias said, his voice rough. He was staring into the fire, not at her. "She's a brave girl," Nora replied softly. "She just needed a distraction." "It was more than that," he said, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were shadowed, his expression unreadable. "Thank you. There's no need to thank me, Mr. Thorne. I care for her." "Elias," he said, the word abrupt. "My name is Elias." It was a small thing, a simple offering of his name. But for them, it was a significant shift. He was no longer just her employer. He was Elias. And she was Nora. The walls were still there, but a small gate had just been opened. The first real intrusion from the outside world came 2 weeks later. Elias and Lily had to go to town for supplies, and he decided it was safer to bring Nora along than to leave her alone at the ranch. As their wagon rolled down the main street of Promise Creek, Nora felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She pulled the brim of her borrowed bonnet lower, hoping not to be recognized. But a town like Promise Creek had a long memory for scandal. As they stepped onto the boardwalk in front of the general store, she saw Mrs. Gable, the town's foremost gossip, stop dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened, and a malicious smile spread across her face. Well, Mrs. Gable said, her voice carrying to everyone on the street. "If it isn't the little pauper bride. And with Elias Thorne. I heard rumors, of course, but to see it in broad daylight." She let the insinuation hang in the air, thick and poisonous. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. Before Elias could say a word, Lily stepped forward, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. "She's not a pauper bride," Lily declared, her child's voice ringing with indignation. "She's Nora, and she lives with us and makes the best biscuits in the whole world." Mrs. Gable gave a condescending chuckle. "Oh, the innocence of children. Elias, you should be careful about the company you keep. For the girl's sake, if not for your own reputation." Elias moved to stand between Mrs. Gable and Nora, his body a solid, protective barrier. His face was like granite. "My company and my daughter's is my own business, Martha," he said, his voice low and cold as a winter river. "Nora is my housekeeper, and I'd thank you to remember that." He put a firm hand on Nora's back and steered her and Lily into the store, leaving Mrs. Gable sputtering on the boardwalk. But the damage was done. Inside the store, the whispers followed them. People stopped their conversations to stare. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was civil enough, but his eyes were full of a pitying curiosity that was almost worse than outright scorn. The ride home was tense and silent. Nora stared out at the passing landscape, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had brought shame to this man's door. She was a stain on his good name, a threat to his daughter. When they got back to the ranch and had unloaded the supplies, she waited until Lily had run off to see her pony. Then she turned to Elias, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "Mr. Thorne, Elias," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I think perhaps it is time for me to leave. I can't have you. I can't be the cause of such talk. It isn't fair to you, or to Lily." Elias was wiping down the horse, his back to her. He didn't stop his work. "Where would you go?" he asked, his voice flat. "I don't know. I could go to the next town. Try to find work." "Doing what? With Croft's story and Martha Gable's tongue following you? You'd find the same trouble there. Or worse." He finally turned to face her, his expression grim. "Running doesn't solve anything, Nora. I learned that a long time ago. But your reputation." "My reputation?" He gave a short, harsh laugh. "In case you haven't noticed, I'm a widower struggling to keep a ranch from going under, with more debt than cattle. My reputation is the last thing I'm worried about. I'm worried about keeping a roof over my daughter's head and food on her plate. You help me do that. The town's gossip doesn't." His words were blunt, stripped of any sentimentality. He was framing it, once again, as a practical matter. But there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of fierce protectiveness that went beyond a simple business arrangement. "I made a decision when I offered you a place here," he continued, his his voice softer now. I knew what the town would say. I don't back down from my decisions. We'll weather it. He held her gaze for a long moment. You're not to talk of leaving again. This is your home. For as long as you need it. He turned back to the horse, the conversation clearly over. Nora stood there, the warm sun on her face, feeling a dizzying mix of relief and a terrifying, burgeoning hope. He had defended her. He had stood against the town for her. He had called this place her home. He had done it all under the guise of practicality. But she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened her, that it was something more. And she was frightened because she realized her own feelings were becoming something more, too. She was no longer just grateful to Elias Thorne. She was beginning to care for him, and for the fragile, beautiful life they were building together in the face of the world's scorn. The weeks turned into a month, then two. The prairie summer deepened, baking the land to a golden brown. The rhythm of their life together became as steady and reliable as the sunrise. Nora's garden, rescued from the weeds, began to produce a surprising bounty of squash, beans, and hardy tomatoes. The cabin felt more like a home with each passing day. The air of stark survival was slowly being replaced by a sense of quiet contentment. Elias found himself changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The hard shell of his grief, which he had worn like armor for 3 years, was beginning to crack. He found himself talking more, sharing small details about the ranch, pointing out a hawk circling high overhead, or explaining the lineage of his best bull. He wasn't talking about Sarah, not yet. That wound was still too deep. But he was opening his world to Nora, bit by bit. He started noticing things about her he hadn't seen before. The way her brow furrowed in concentration when she was mending. The small, private smile she had when she watched Lily play. The way she would stand on the porch in the evening, her face turned toward the sunset, a look of quiet, resilient hope in her eyes. She was not beautiful in the way of the women in magazines, the ones with soft hands and fashionable dresses. Her beauty was in her strength, in her quiet grace under pressure, in the fierce, gentle spirit that had refused to be broken by cruelty and hardship. He found himself looking for her smile, listening for the sound of her humming as she worked. These things were becoming essential to his day, as necessary as the sun and the rain. One evening, he came into the cabin late, exhausted after a long day spent chasing down a stray calf. He was covered in dust and sweat, his muscles aching. He had expected to find a plate of food left for him on the stove. Instead, he found Nora sitting at the table, a book open in front of her, the lamp turned down low. Lily was already asleep. I saved you a plate, she said softly, getting up to fetch it from the warming oven. He washed up at the basin, the cool water a balm on his skin. When he sat down at the table, she placed the plate of hot stew in front of him, along with a fresh biscuit. She didn't leave, but sat back down across from him, picking up her book again. What are you reading? He asked, the question surprising even himself. She held it up. It was a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. It was my mother's, she said. She was a teacher before she married. She believed words held a kind of magic. Elias stared at her. He had assumed, like everyone else, that she was an uneducated girl from a poor background. You can read, he said, the statement flat with surprise. A faint, wry smile touched her lips. Yes, and I can do sums, and I know a little Latin. The orphanage matron believed a practical education was best, but I preferred the impractical one I found in the books she kept locked away. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of shame for his own assumptions. He had seen her as a victim, a project, a housekeeper. He had never once thought to ask who she was before she stepped off that train. My wife, Sarah, she loved books, he said, the words feeling strange and rusty in his mouth. It was the first time he had volunteered a memory of his wife to her. She tried to teach me to read, but I never had the patience for it. I can sign my name and read a bill of sale. That's about the extent of it. It's never too late to learn, Nora said gently, her eyes soft in the lamplight. He shook his head, looking down at his calloused, dirt-stained hands. These hands are for plows and reins, not for turning pages. Those hands provide for your daughter. They built this house. They offered a stranger a home, she countered, her voice quiet but firm. There is more than one kind of strength, Elias. More than one kind of knowledge. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the chirping of crickets outside. The space between them felt charged, different. He had let her see a glimpse of his own perceived failings, and she had met it not with pity, but with respect. He felt a profound shift inside him, a loosening of a knot he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. The fragile peace of their world was shattered the following week. Elias was in the barn, sharpening an axe, when he saw a buggy approaching. It wasn't just any buggy, it was the polished, expensive rig belonging to Jedediah Croft. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seized him. Croft pulled up and stepped down, his movements crisp and proprietary. He was dressed in a fine suit, a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of the ranch. He surveyed the property with a disdainful sneer. "Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the same arrogant boom as it had on the train platform. "I need a word." Elias set the axe down slowly, deliberately. He walked out of the barn to meet him, positioning himself between Croft and the cabin, where he knew Nora and Lily were. "Croft, this is private property. You're not welcome here." Croft laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. "I'm not here for a social call. I'm here on business. It's about the woman." "The housekeeper," he said the word with a sneer, making it sound sordid. "Her name is Nora," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she's no business of yours. On the contrary, I've been thinking. I made a mistake. The girl is healthier than she appeared. And word is, she's a hard worker. I paid her passage here. In a manner of speaking, that makes her my investment. My property. I've come to collect her." Elias felt a surge of rage so pure and hot it nearly blinded him. He clenched his fists at his sides, fighting the primal urge to drive his fist into Croft's smug face. "She is not a stray cow you lost on the trail, Croft. She is a free woman. She made her own choice to work here. A choice made under duress, I'm sure," Croft said smoothly. "A penniless woman, alone. You took advantage of her situation, Thorne. The town is already talking. It doesn't look good. A widower, a young woman, living under the same roof. It's indecent. But if she were to come work for me, in my respectable household, under the watchful eye of my staff, well, that would put a stop to the gossip, wouldn't it? It would be for her own good." It was a trap, and Elias saw it clearly. Croft wasn't interested in Nora. He was interested in power, in rectifying what he saw as a public slight to his judgment. He wanted to reclaim what he had thrown away simply to prove that he could. And he was using the town's morality as a weapon. The cabin door opened, and Nora stepped out onto the porch. Lily was right behind her, her small face pale with fear. Nora's face was composed, but Elias could see the terror in her eyes. Croft's smile widened when he saw her. "Ah, there she is. Miss Vance. Pack your things. You'll be coming with me. We'll forget all about that unfortunate misunderstanding at the station." Nora's chin came up. "I am not going anywhere with you, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "My place is here." "Your place?" Croft sneered. "You have no place. You are a pauper. You will do as you are told." He took a step toward the porch. Elias moved instantly, blocking his path. He was shorter than Croft, but broader, and his body was corded with the hard muscle of a man who worked from sunup to sundown. "You will not take another step toward my house or toward her," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "You will get in your buggy, and you will leave my land." Now, Croft's face flushed with anger. "You can't stop me, Thorne. I have rights." "You have no rights here," Elias shot back. "This is my land, and everyone on it is under my protection." He said the words without thinking, but as soon as they were out, he knew they were the truest thing he had ever said. She was under his protection. The realization settled deep in his bones, an undeniable, unshakable fact. For a long moment, the two men stood face to face, a silent battle of wills waged in the dusty ranch yard. Croft was a man used to getting his way through money and intimidation. But he saw something in Elias's eyes that gave him pause, a raw, primal ferocity that he had not expected. It was the look of a man defending his territory, his family. Croft finally broke the standoff, a bitter, frustrated expression on his face. He clearly hadn't expected such resistance. "This isn't over, Thorne," he spat. "There are other ways. The law, the church. People will listen to a man of my standing. They will see this for the sordid arrangement it is." He climbed back into his buggy, snapped the reins, and rode away, leaving a cloud of angry dust in his wake. Elias stood watching until the buggy was a small speck on the horizon. His whole body was trembling with adrenaline and fury. He turned and looked at Nora, who was still standing on the porch, her arms wrapped around Lily, who had buried her face in Nora's skirt. Nora's eyes met his, and in them, he saw a reflection of his own fear, but also a profound, heart-stopping gratitude. He knew Croft was right about one thing. This wasn't over. A direct confrontation had failed, so Croft would turn to sneakier, more poisonous methods. He would use the town, use their gossip and their piety, to destroy them. The fragile sanctuary they had built was now under siege. He had to protect it. He had to protect her. And he realized, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that a simple declaration of her being his housekeeper was no longer going to be enough. He needed a stronger defense. He needed a permanent solution. The thought that bloomed in his mind was both insane and perfectly logical. It was terrifying, and it was the only thing that made any sense at all. In the days following Croft's visit, a palpable tension settled over the ranch. The quiet comfort they had built was now laced with a shared anxiety. Every distant cloud of dust on the horizon could be another visitor, another threat. Every trip to town was now out of the question. They were isolated, a small island bracing for a storm they knew was coming. Elias became even quieter, more withdrawn, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the heavy, watchful silence of a man contemplating a difficult choice. Nora saw him pacing the length of the porch late at night, staring out into the darkness. She knew he was trying to find a way to protect them, and she felt a painful sense of guilt. She was the cause of this trouble, the storm that had broken over his peaceful, lonely life. One evening, after Lily was asleep, Nora found him by the corral, leaning against the fence, staring at the stars. "He will not give up," she said, her voice soft in the cool night air. It wasn't a question. Elias didn't turn. "No. Men like Croft see people as possessions. He thinks I stole something of his. I could leave," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I could slip away in the night. He would have no reason to trouble you further." "And go where?" he asked, his voice rough. "I told you, running is not an answer. He'd find you. Or you'd find someone just like him in the next town over. This isn't about you, Nora. Not really. It's about him. It's about his pride." He finally turned to face her, his features stark in the moonlight. "He'll go to the preacher. He'll go to the sheriff. He'll paint me as a sinner and you as a harlot. He'll try to get the church to have you run out of the county. He might even try to get them to take Lily away from me, claiming I'm an unfit father." The last possibility hit Nora with the force of a physical blow. The thought of them taking Lily from this man who loved her more than life itself was monstrous. "They wouldn't," she breathed, horrified. "They might," Elias said, his voice grim. "Croft is a wealthy man. He contributes to the church-building fund. He holds the bank's mortgage on half the ranches in this valley, including mine." His voice carries weight. Nora wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill running through her despite the mildness of the night. She saw the trap closing around them, and it was her fault. "Then what can we do?" Elias was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on her face. The moonlight softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing the weariness and the conflict in his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, as if he had weighed every word 100 times. "There is one thing we can do," he said. "One thing that would silence the gossip. One thing that would give you my name and my protection in a way that not even Croft could challenge." He took a deep breath. "We could get married." Nora stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The words hung between them, surreal and momentous. Marriage. It was the one thing she had traveled 1,000 miles for, and the one thing she had believed was now forever lost to her. It wouldn't be a real marriage," he continued quickly, as if afraid she would misunderstand. "Not in that way. It would be a partnership, a business arrangement like we have now, but on paper. Legal. It would be for Lily's sake, and for yours. To protect you. To give you a name and a standing in this community. No one could question your place here if you were my wife." He was offering her a shield, a fortress built of his own name. It was a proposal born not of love, but of grim necessity. A marriage of convenience. It was the most practical, logical solution. And yet, it felt like the most terrifying, monumental step she could possibly take. To tie herself to this man, to this life, forever. "You would do that?" she whispered. "You would tie yourself to me?" A woman who has brought you nothing but trouble. You have brought more than trouble, he said, and his voice was suddenly thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. You brought this house back to life. You gave my daughter her laughter back. He stopped, unable to continue. He looked away, toward the dark outline of the hills. It's a fair trade. My name for the home you've made for us. It's a practical arrangement. Practical. He kept using that word, as if it could strip the emotion out of what he was proposing. But Nora's heart was clamoring with anything but practicality. She thought of his quiet strength, his unwavering decency. She thought of Lily's fierce affection, of the way the child's hand fit so perfectly in hers. She thought of the wildflowers on the table, the shared silence of the evenings, the feeling of rightness she felt when she stood on the porch and looked out at this land. This wasn't just a place of refuge anymore. It was home. And these two people, they were her family. To marry him out of necessity felt like both a blessing and a curse. To be his wife in name only, to live so close to him and yet be so far, seemed a special kind of torture. But the alternative, to leave or to be driven out, to lose him and Lily, was unthinkable. She looked at his strong, weathered profile, at the loneliness he tried so hard to hide. She knew he was still in love with the memory of his wife. She could never replace Sarah. But maybe, just maybe, she could be his partner, his friend. And maybe, for now, that could be enough. Yes, she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet night. Yes, Elias. I will marry you. He turned back to her, and she saw a flicker of raw, unguarded relief in his eyes before he masked it again. He gave a single, curt nod. Good. We'll ride into town tomorrow. We'll see the justice of the peace. We'll do it before Croft can make his next move. There were no flowers, no white dress, no joyful gathering of friends and family. Their wedding took place in the dusty, cluttered office of Judge Miller, the justice of the peace, a man whose breath smelled of stale coffee and whose primary interest was in getting the paperwork filed before his lunch. Lily was their only witness, clutching both of their hands, her face a mask of solemn importance. Nora wore her one good dress, the same one she had worn on the train, but she had mended the worn cuffs and added a collar of lace she had painstakingly tatted herself. Elias wore his Sunday shirt, scrubbed clean and smelling of lye soap. They stood before the judge, two strangers bound by circumstance, and recited the simple, powerful vows. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, there was an awkward pause. Elias looked at Nora, his expression unreadable. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might try to kiss her, a gesture that would have felt both required and utterly false. Instead, he simply took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. It's done, he said, his voice low. You're Mrs. Thorne now. Nora Thorne. The name felt foreign, heavy. She looked down at their joined hands. It was the hand of a farmer, a rancher. It was a hand that knew only work. And it was the hand of the man who was now her husband. The ride back to the ranch was as silent as the first one had been, but this time the silence was charged with a different kind of tension. They were no longer an employer and his housekeeper. They were husband and wife. The words had changed everything and nothing. They would still sleep in separate rooms. They would still maintain their careful distance. But a line had been crossed, a legal and social bond forged that could not be undone. When they arrived back at the cabin, the place looked exactly the same, yet Nora felt as if she were seeing it for the first time. This was her home now, not by temporary agreement, but by law. This was her family. That evening, the awkwardness was a palpable thing. Lily, in her childish innocence, was the only one who seemed unaffected. She chattered on about the judge's messy desk and the funny way he had cleared his throat. But Elias and Nora barely spoke, moving around each other with a new, stilted caution. After Lily was in bed, Nora began to clear the table, her movements jerky. Elias remained seated, turning his empty coffee cup in his hands. Nora, he said, his voice stopping her. She turned, her heart starting to beat a little faster. That room, he said, gesturing toward the tiny storage room that was hers. It's too small. My wife shouldn't be sleeping in a closet. He cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the table. Sarah's my room. It's large. There's a couch in there. A small one. You could sleep there. It would be more comfortable. And it would look more proper if anyone were to come calling. He was thinking of appearances, of maintaining the fiction of their marriage. But the thought of sleeping in the same room as him, the room that had been his and Sarah's, sent a wave of panic and a strange, illicit thrill through her. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll take the cot in the storage room," he said. "It's fine for me." He was offering her his own bed, his own room, the most private space in his life. He was exiling himself for her comfort and for the sake of their arrangement. The generosity of the gesture, hidden under his usual gruff practicality, was overwhelming. "No," she said, more firmly than she intended. "That was your room. With your wife. It should remain yours." She took a breath, steeling herself. "I will take the couch, but you will sleep in your own bed. It is the only way this is right." He looked up at her then, and she saw a deep, aching sadness in his eyes, a flicker of the grief he kept so tightly leashed. He was giving her his name, his home, his protection, but his heart, she knew, was still buried with his first wife, and she would not, could not, trespass on that sacred ground. He gave a slow nod of acceptance. "As you wish." That night, Nora lay on the small couch in his room, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the sound of his breathing from the large bed across the dark space. The room still held the faint, lingering scent of Sarah, a hint of lavender from a sachet tucked in a drawer, she supposed. It was a ghost perfume. She felt like an intruder, a usurper. And yet, listening to the steady rhythm of Elias's breathing, she also felt safer than she ever had in her life. She was Nora Thorne. She was his wife. And whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The news of their marriage hit Promise Creek like a thunderclap. Elias made sure of it. The next day, he rode into town alone, filed the marriage certificate at the courthouse, and then went to the general store to buy a 50-pound sack of flour and a small bag of lemon drops for Lily, a deliberate, public performance of domesticity. When Martha Gable cornered him by the pickle barrel, her face a mask of shocked disapproval, he met her head-on. "I hear you've done a rash thing, Elias," she said, her voice dripping with condemnation. "I married a good woman, Martha," he replied, his voice calm and even. He hefted the sack of flour onto his shoulder. "My wife, Nora Thorne, needed a husband, and my daughter and I needed a wife and a mother." It seemed the most sensible thing in the world. He had framed it as a practical, respectable arrangement, leaving no room for sordid speculation. He had used the word mother. The word was a shield, a claim, a public declaration that Nora was not some temporary convenience, but a permanent, integral part of his family. The gossip wouldn't stop, of course, but he had robbed it of its most venomous power. He had legitimized their relationship in the only way the town would understand. But the real test came a few days later. As Elias had predicted, Jedediah Croft was not a man to accept defeat. He arrived at the ranch not in a buggy, but on horseback, and he was not alone. Sheriff Brody and Reverend Michael were with him. It was an official delegation, an assembly of the town's power and morality. Nora saw them coming from the kitchen window, and her blood ran cold. She called for Elias, who was mending a fence by the barn. He came at once, wiping his hands on his trousers, his face grim. He had been expecting this. "Nora, you and Lily go inside," he commanded. "Stay there." "No," Nora said, her voice surprisingly firm. She came out onto the porch to stand beside him. "I am your wife. This concerns me. I will stand with you." Elias looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, a look of profound pride crossed his face. He gave a short, sharp nod. Lily came and stood between them, holding both of their hands. They stood on the porch, a united front, as the three riders approached. "Thorne," Sheriff Brody said, tipping his hat. He looked uncomfortable. "Reverend, Mr. Croft here has lodged a complaint. A serious one. Mr. Croft has been spreading lies," Elias said, his voice flat. "He claims you coerced Miss Vance into an unnatural living arrangement," the Reverend said, his face stern and judgmental. "And now, this hasty marriage, it seems a desperate attempt to cover a sin." "There is no sin to cover, Reverend," Elias said calmly. "I have married an honorable woman and brought her into my home to be a mother to my child. The only unnatural thing here is Mr. Croft's obsession with a woman who wants nothing to do with him." Croft's face purpled with rage. "She is a penniless opportunist. She tricked you, Thorne. I came to rescue her from this squalor, and from your clutches. It was then that Nora found her voice. All the fear, all the shame she had carried since that day on the train platform, coalesced into a cold, hard anger. She stepped forward. You, Mr. Croft, offered me nothing but public humiliation, she said, her voice ringing with a clarity and strength that made all three men look at her in surprise. You threw me away like a piece of garbage because you decided I wasn't a pretty enough investment. You speak of sin? The only sin I see is a man's pride being so vast that he cannot bear to see a woman he discarded find a place of safety and respect. She turned her gaze to the Reverend. Reverend Michael, you preach of charity and compassion on Sundays. Elias Thorne showed me both when no one else would. He offered me work when I was destitute. He gave me shelter when I had none. And yes, he has now given me his name and his protection, because Mr. Croft's vicious gossip threatened to destroy my reputation and this family. Is that a sin? Or is it the very definition of Christian duty? The Reverend had the grace to look shamefaced. He had heard only one side of the story, the one backed by money and influence. Sheriff Brody shifted his weight. The law is only concerned with facts, ma'am. Mr. Croft suggested you were being held here against your will. Sheriff, Nora said, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its steel. Look at me. Do I look like a prisoner? I am standing on the porch of my own home, next to my husband and my daughter. She squeezed Lily's hand. This is where I belong. This is the life I have chosen. Her words, simple and direct, were more powerful than any legal argument. She was not the weeping, helpless victim Croft had painted her to be. She was a woman who knew her own mind, standing her own ground. Croft, seeing his support crumble, made one last, desperate attempt. This is a sham, a marriage of convenience to quiet the gossips. It's a mockery of the Holy Sacrament. Elias took a step forward, his hand resting on the porch post. He looked directly at Croft, his eyes cold. Every marriage is a marriage of convenience, Croft. People marry for land, for money, for heirs. I married for a home, for a partner to help me raise my child and work this land, for a good woman's quiet strength. If that's a mockery, then so be it. But it's my mockery on my land, and you are no longer welcome on it. His voice was a low rumble of finality. He was no longer just defending Nora. He was defining their marriage on his own terms, imbuing it with a truth and dignity that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with respect, partnership, and shared life. Sheriff Brody held up a hand. That's enough, Jedediah. There's no crime been committed here. Mrs. Thorne has made her wishes clear. This is a family matter. It's time we left. He turned his horse without waiting for a reply. The Reverend, after a moment's hesitation and a mumbled apology, followed suit. Croft was left alone, his face a mask of thwarted fury. He stared at the three of them on the porch, the unmovable man, the unbreakable woman, and the child who bound them together. He had lost. He had been defeated not by force or by law, but by the simple, powerful truth of their unity. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his posture radiating impotent rage. They stood and watched him go, the dust settling in his wake. The threat, for now, was gone. Nora's knees suddenly felt weak, and she leaned against the doorframe for support. Elias turned to her, his face still grim, but the coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, blazing warmth. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently brush a stray piece of hair from her forehead. His fingers barely grazed her skin, but a jolt went through her, sharp and electric. You were good, Nora, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You were stronger than I've ever seen. I was terrified, she admitted, her voice trembling. I know, he said, but you stood anyway. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in that moment, the pretense of their marriage, the practicality, the convenience, seemed to fall away. They were not just partners in an arrangement. They had faced down the world together. They had stood as one. He was her husband, and she was his wife. And as he looked at her, a slow, rare smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire weary countenance. And in that smile, Nora saw the promise of something she had never dared to hope for, not just a home, but a future. The confrontation with Croft marked the true beginning of their marriage. The town's gossip didn't vanish overnight, but its nature changed. The whispers were now tinged with a grudging respect. Elias Thorne had stood his ground, and his new wife had proven to be a woman of unexpected substance. They had become a local legend of sorts, the quiet widower and the spurned bride who, together, had faced down the valley's most powerful man and won. Life at the ranch settled into a new kind of normal. The awkwardness between Nora and Elias began to dissolve, replaced by a comfortable intimacy born of shared struggle and mutual respect. They were a team, working in tandem to run the ranch and raise Lily. He taught her how to milk the cow and how to spot a sick calf. She taught him, slowly and patiently, how to read. In the evenings, after Lily was asleep, they would sit at the kitchen table, their heads bent over a primer or an old copy of the local newspaper. His large, calloused finger would trace the words as she pronounced them, her voice a soft, steady guide in the quiet cabin. It was in these quiet lessons that their walls truly came down. He was vulnerable with her, admitting his ignorance, and she was his patient, gentle teacher. They learned more than just words on a page. They learned the rhythms of each other's thoughts, the shape of each other's dreams. He started talking about Sarah, not often, but in small, precious fragments. He told Nora how Sarah had loved the wildflowers on the East Hill, how she had sung off-key when she churned butter. He wasn't comparing them. He was sharing his past, making Nora a custodian of his memories, just as she had become for Lily. He was letting her into the walled garden of his grief, and she walked there with quiet, respectful steps. One afternoon, he came in from the fields to find Nora at the table, her head in her hands, weeping silently. A wave of cold fear washed over him. He rushed to her side, his heart pounding. "Nora? What is it? Are you hurt?" She looked up, her face streaked with tears, but she was smiling through them. She held up a letter. "It's from the orphanage," she choked out. "From the matron. I wrote to her when we married, to tell her I was safe. She writes that she is proud of me." She dissolved into fresh tears. "No one has ever said they were proud of me before." Without thinking, Elias wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a hug. It was the first time they had touched with deliberate, comforting intent. She was small and trembling in his arms. He held her tight, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soothing, nonsensical words. He was comforting her, but he realized with a jolt that he was also taking comfort from her, from the simple, profound rightness of holding her. The scent of her hair, of soap and sunshine, filled his senses. She leaned into him, her tears soaking his shirt, and in that moment, she was not his housekeeper, not his partner in a practical arrangement. She was his wife, and his heart ached with a fierce, protective tenderness that felt startlingly new and yet deeply familiar. He knew, in that instant, that he was in love with her. The realization didn't come like a lightning strike, but like the slow, inexorable dawn. It had been growing in the quiet moments, in the shared laughter with Lily, in the late-night reading lessons, in the stand they had taken together on the porch. His love for Sarah was a part of him, a cherished memory that would always be there. But this new feeling, this love for Nora, was a living, breathing thing. It was a love born not of youthful passion, but of shared hardship, deep respect, and the quiet miracle of a second chance. He didn't say anything. The words were too new, too immense. But as he held her, he knew that the marriage of convenience had become something else entirely. It had, against all odds, become real. The final proof came a few weeks later, on Lily's 10th birthday. Nora had been planning it for weeks. She had saved the egg money and, on a rare solo trip to town, had bought flour, sugar, and a small bag of precious cinnamon. She spent the entire day baking a magnificent cinnamon cake, filling the cabin with a warm, sweet aroma. She had also sewn Lily a new dress from a bolt of blue calico, working late into the night by lamplight. When Lily saw the cake and the dress, her eyes grew as wide as saucers. She threw her arms around Nora's neck, burying her face in her shoulder. Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Later that evening, the three of them sat on the porch, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. Lily, wearing her new dress, sat between them, leaning her head sleepily against Nora's shoulder. Elias was whittling a small wooden bird for his daughter, the shavings falling at his feet. A comfortable, happy silence enveloped them. Lily, half asleep, murmured, "This was the best birthday ever." She looked up at Nora, her eyes soft in the twilight. "You know," she said, her voice a sleepy whisper, "if Ma existed, she'd mirror her." She repeated the words she had spoken so long ago, but now they were not a child's hopeful comparison. They were a statement of fact, a declaration of a truth that had taken root and blossomed in their small cabin. She wasn't replacing her mother. She was acknowledging that the empty space had been filled with a love that was just as real, just as true. Nora's eyes filled with tears. She kissed the top of Lily's head, her heart feeling as if it might burst. She looked over at Elias. He had stopped whittling. He was looking at her, his face illuminated by the rising moon. The guardedness was gone from his eyes, the deep well of his sorrow finally filled. In its place was a look of such profound love and gratitude that it took her breath away. He reached across Lily and took Nora's hand, his fingers lacing with hers. He didn't need to say the words. She could feel them in his touch, see them in his eyes. The pain of her past, the humiliation at the train station, the cruelty of Jedediah Croft, it all seemed like a story that had happened to someone else in another lifetime. Her life had begun here, in this small cabin, with this quiet, decent man and his fierce, loving daughter. He had offered her a job, then his name, then his protection. But somewhere along the way, without either of them realizing it, he had given her his heart, and she had given him hers in return. She squeezed his hand, a silent answer to the question he had not yet asked. The prairie night was vast and silent around them, but for the first time in her life, Nora felt she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was not a spurned pauper bride. She was Nora Thorne, a wife, a mother. She was home. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.